So good morning, everyone. Sunday, third Sunday of the month. We are returning to the book On the Way to the Light by Francisco Xavier, by the Spirit Emmanuel, psychographed by Francisco Xavier. And we are studying chapter 13, the Roman Empire and its aberrations. And we are going to start reading today at the collective trials of the Jews and Romans. Reminding everyone of what we discussed last month, that by the time of the Common Era, year zero, Rome was in absolute decadence by its own greed, by its own laziness. And because of that, the entire enterprise, the entire machinery of
You must listen to the announcement. We can't keep double stopping.
the entire machinery of the great Roman Empire, which had received so much assistance from high above to be able to unite all the peoples of the earth at the time, that entire machinery was now completely dismantled, engorged by its own greed, by its own decadence, by its own lack of faith, lack of direction. And we see that it's in the midst of this whole turmoil that our Master Jesus Christ incarnates on planet Earth in the physical realm, trying to bring to us an idea of a God that was no longer a God of punishment or a God that was disciplinarian, but a God that was more paternal in its, or in his, I might say in this case, in his behavior. A God that would always offer us another opportunity as long as we had sincerity in our hearts. Christ comes at this moment in history because we had already been prepared by so many prophets and also by the civilizations that preceded this great point in history, particularly the Greeks, who brought to us the concept of beauty. Never before had we seen it in human history. The Greeks brought to us the ideals of perfection, the ideals of beauty, and the philosophical beliefs. Other civilizations had their moments, also contributed, but not as much as the Greeks did in this particular aspect. The Romans, at first, when we see them in the before the Common Era, at the end of the times of just before the empire, the Romans did bring all the knowledge from the Greeks to Rome. And it's exactly this knowledge that allowed Rome to flourish in the sense of the arts, the literature. But unfortunately, the Romans lost their way in their lascivity, in their greed, and all that went to ruins even before the great empire did. So Christ comes to us at this moment because we are prepared to understand now the concept of beauty, and from the concept of beauty, an extrapolation to more abstract forms of behavior, such as universal love. Christ could not have done this job before because humanity as a whole did not understand certain abstract ideas. For him to speak to us about charity, about love, about understanding, tolerance, we had to have evolved to that level to be able to grasp things that were beyond the material world. This was the time. Humanity was ripe for it. And it is now that Christ infuses us with all of these ideals of love, of perfection, of an understanding and forgiving Father. But unfortunately, we chose, I'm going to use the word we here, the pronoun we, because most of us were there amidst the Romans or the Israelites. Either side, it really doesn't matter. We are both guilty of not seizing that opportunity to grow. So we ended up crucifying our master. The crucifixion was not something that was done specially to him. That was how we used to deal with criminals. And this is why it's so embarrassing for all of us humans. Because in the end, it was not just that we did not take the opportunity to learn from the Master, to learn from his examples, but we actually placed him amidst criminals. Our hatred to the concepts that he brought to us, our difficulty in understanding that we needed to be more forgiving, that we need to share more, got to such an extent that it led us to label him much like a criminal. And it is this that we are going to be dealing with here in the collective trials of the Jews and Romans. Those who were in power, and those, the Romans, and those who represented Jesus' own people. We must not forget that Jesus Christ, while here on earth, he was a Jewish man. And both peoples, in this case, have a collective trial or a collective consequence to deal with. This consequence, we need to understand it. It's not because they allowed Christ to be crucified. We have to be very careful, because if we see it this way, we think of Christ as being a punishing individual, as someone seeking revenge. This is not the case. The collective trial of these two peoples come from the fact that they did not reform themselves and that they continue on their path to self-destruction, creating consequences for themselves. This is where the trial now resides, not on the crucifixion of the Master. Jesus was already a perfected spirit at that time. For him, he understood the situation and embraced whatever it is that they threw at him. It is not an idea of revenge, and this must be very clear to everyone. The collective trials, therefore, are nothing more than the inability of those two peoples, the Romans and the Jews, to reform themselves. They had the Master right then and there, right next to them, and they missed a wonderful opportunity. And we, as their descendants, have been missing opportunity after opportunity ever since. If we are still on this planet or we're still around, it's because we have not understood the teachings, or we have not applied them to our daily lives. In essence, we are perhaps one of the collective trials. Whether we were from one people or the other, it's immaterial. The fact is that we are still around, which means that we have to put more effort to learn, all of us, to learn from examples that were given to us now over 2,000 years ago. So let us read the collective trials of the Jews and Romans. Zoraida, are you going to read for us?
Okay, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. The collective trials of the Jews and Romans. The humble followers of the Nazarene began their preaching and teaching in the regions of Palestine. Only a few of the apostles understood the subliminated mission of that sacrosanct doctrine, which toward returning good for evil and forgiving one's enemies. The solicitous emissaries of the Lord followed their activities closely, preparing the way for the ideological revolution of the gospel. These messengers from the higher realms also began their indirect efforts of helping the empire in its glorious elective trials. A perfect work of selection took place in the spiritual environment of Roman society. Inspirations from on high rained down, foretelling the path of Jerusalem and the sufferings of the imperial city. Foreboding prophecies weighed heavily on all rebellious and guilty spirits. And the truth is that after the siege of Jerusalem, when Titus destroyed the city, razing its famous temple and scattering the Israelites forever, the haunted conqueror saw the cause of the suffering transferred to the empire's society. Tormented by the storms of fire and ash that raged Stabia, Herculaneum, and Pompeii, destroying thousands of flourishing lives and unending Roman existence forever.
Thank you. Okay. So I have already spoiled a little bit of this text that we just read because I mentioned that there was quite a lot of assistance to that region, but particularly to Rome, since Rome had the capital, the military forces, and the entire infrastructure to unite all the peoples that used to live on earth at the time. And yet, as I mentioned, Rome, in its unabated greed, in its unabated ambition, ended up destroying itself. It's important when we read the history of humanity to realize that all empires fall from within. They are always destroyed from within. Rome, the largest of all of them, not the longest, but the largest of all of them in territory, was actually no exception. So here we have, right after the death of our master, the consequences. Look, as I said before, the consequences are simply the lack of effort to reform oneself. The master was there, the examples were fresh, and he left followers, the followers of the Nazarene, as it says here, that began preaching and teaching everywhere, especially in the Palestine. But very little was, was heeded. Very few actually paid attention to what they had to say. And especially at the very beginning, they were persecuted heavily, extensively, and cruelly until we see eventually the even the construction of the great circus, the Colosseum, that was used actually in some of its functions was actually to hold spectacles of the destruction of the Christians, of the first Christians. Let us be very careful here to always say Christians, not Catholics, because we are going to see, especially in the next 2 chapters, that we have to make a distinction. At this time, we don't have Catholics. What we have are just simply Christians, the followers of Jesus Christ. Okay? So we see the examples were there. We see that we gave very little heed to those examples. And we still have the followers preaching, but not all of them could grasp the meaning, the deep meanings of the teachings of our Master. Even among the apostles, even among his closest followers, not all of them had a good grasp or even a perfect grasp of of the teachings of our Master. Nevertheless, they were there, even if they're a little distorted or a little incomplete, they were there, but they were still being ignored. And the Romans continue. Here we find ourselves more focused on of the Palestine region, and we speak of Jerusalem in particular because Jerusalem was actually razed to the ground twice at this point. And we see that the two peoples, the Jews and the Romans, were at each other's throats the whole time. And in this, no reform of the spirit, no reform by using the ideals of the Nazarene, the ideals that we see in the next page at the very beginning, when he speak of good, returning good for evil, returning forgiveness for an insult. And we are going to see that even that, the good for evil, the forgiveness for an insult, was completely misunderstood later on, creating a concept that was not what the Master intended. When the Master taught us to return good for evil, he was not saying that we should be like, even though he used in his analogies, in his allegories, the idea of a sheep, the idea of the shepherd, and so on and so forth. The idea was not for us to be submissive. And eventually, the concept of returning good for evil acquired a concept or an idea of submission, of someone relinquishing their own free will. The Master had never said that. There is not a single passage that speaks of that. The good for evil was an understanding that the one producing the evil was nothing more than a sick individual. And if we could not forgive right away, we at least should allow ourselves to move away from that situation so that we would not become a contributor to such a situation. But the Romans were too proud, had been the conquerors and the lords of the world for already 400 years. So they were too proud to accept such a thing. The Jews had they had the Romans across their throats because they had to pay tribute to Rome. Rome was the conqueror and represented the conqueror, also represented the owner of everything that used to be theirs. So the two peoples ended up at a war with one another. And this continued on, and we are going to see that the consequences that this brought to them is quite a lot of misery, quite a lot of difficulties and vicissitudes in the years to come. And Emmanuel mentions here the destruction, the razing of Stabia, Herculaneum, and Pompeii, and that's when the Vesuvius uh, um, produced a lot of lava, not explode exactly, but produced a lot of lava and erupted. And basically interred or all of these cities. This is just one of them, and perhaps Emmanuel calls our attention to these cities because we know of them, we have an idea, right? But there were many other things that happened. There were plagues during the Roman Empire, and quite ironically, the very pride of Rome, all the, for instance, all the roads that they had built throughout Europe actually contributed to the expansion of the plagues at the time. And actually, they were also responsible for the expansion of the bubonic plague a few centuries later as well. So we see that it was an empire left without any care, without any maintenance, because greed had taken over. Complete greed had taken over. And nothing was done. The master comes, gives us the examples of life. The Jews were there, they had a tradition already of discussing the sacred texts. They had a tradition of a monotheistic society, which was very peculiar because remember, the Romans were polytheists. And yet, even the Jews could not accept and incorporate the teachings of our Master because it still went against their pride, still went against their traditions, especially when we had as the major teaching from our Master the exchange of good for evil. We have the passage where a few of them come around Jesus Christ and said, if it's licit to them to pay the tribute to Caesar, and they produce a coin, and Jesus, knowing their malice, tells them, which face, which effigy do you see on this coin? Isn't that Caesar's? And they answer that it's Caesar's, and then he says, you render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's. So this had always been a very sore point for them, and they could never get past that. And we are going to see that this vanity, this pride, this unchecked pride will lead both peoples to a lot of consequences, of disastrous consequences in the years to come.
Okay. Okay.
Any questions? No questions? Okay, Sarai.
Okay. The end of human vanity. The Roman Empire could have affected the following of a soul state on the planet due to the marvelous unity it achieved, and thanks to the efforts and the watch care from on high, but instead it disappeared in a sea of ruins after its wars, aberrations and circuses filled with wild beasts and gladiators. The enormous organism began rotting away in the open sores opened by the negligence and impiety of its children. And when the palliative of mercy from selfless and compassionate spirits was no longer possible due to the galvanization of the overall sentiment on the broad table of earthly excesses and pleasure, suffering was called in to reestablish the fundamentals of the truth in souls. Nothing was left of the proud city of the emperors except piles of stone. Under the lash of expiation and suffering, guilty spirits changed their garments in order to evolve and redeem themselves in the infinite scenery of life. And while many of them continue to weep in redemptive suffering, the sad and lamenting winds of the night mourn over the ruins of Vespasian's Colosseum.
Thank you. So this is just Emmanuel's closing remarks about the Roman Empire. At the time of the Emperor Vespasian, it's quite interesting. There was a year just before Vespasian. There was a year so Vespasian is actually the fourth of 4 emperors in 1 year. It's called the Flavian Dynasty. And Flavian Dynasty starts right after Vespasian. So Vespasian is the 4th emperor in 1 year, one assassinating the other. This is just to give you an idea of how disturbing, how out of control the Roman society and Roman politics was at the time. And of course, we have in Vespasian's reign, during his empire, the construction of the Colosseum for the martyrdom of the first Christians in particular, and for also other brutal games. The Colosseum was not built for the Christians. It was built for games. It's just that the concept of games for the Romans was very brutish, to say the least. And of course, they all involved, even among the gladiators, when we're not talking about Christians in particular, even among the gladiators, some of the games were to the death. So we see a society that is completely out of control, completely given to the pleasures of the flesh, to the extreme. Everything was in the extreme. And with that, no maintenance. And the whole machinery of that beautiful empire that had been put together, that had been galvanized by the hard work of the first Etruscans, later to be called the Romans, and with the assistance of the spiritual realm, all of that went to ruins. As much as we now see of what is left from such a great empire.
You can hear me?
Yes?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jan.
I just wanted to comment because I'm really baffled by the title that he gave to this little passage, The End of Human Vanity. It seems so optimistic and at the same time erroneous a statement.
Yes, I agree. Because it's not the end, of course not. No, I agree. I mean, I guess there is a little bit of nostalgia or sadness in Emmanuel's tone. Since we know Emmanuel from being Publius Lentulus, a Roman senator. So perhaps he sees this as like the end of the world, right? And this is probably why he chose these words, but this is my opinion. This is not in any text. I must make this very clear.
Right,
it must be difficult for him to speak of this time. And also knowing that when he was there, he actually met our master. He met Christ, and he was one of them who denied Christ. His wife did not, Livia. His wife embraced Christianity from the moment she laid eyes. Actually, she heard the master, but not Emmanuel. It took him another reincarnation.
Yep. Yeah.
Julio, don't you think that this can be applied to today? Everything is if you just. It seems to me that this is sort of like, it reminds me a lot of premises of the new age of Aquarius that I've been reading about. It seems that, the Roman, as he said, the Roman Empire could have affected the founding of a soul state on the planet due to the marvelous unity it achieved and thanks to the efforts and much care from on high. And as you know, I think you must have heard also stories that, I'm not going to say his name, but the current administration is the Antichrist. I don't know where I read this coming from Brazil. I don't know if it was Evaldo who had mentioned in passing or had mentioned before. It seems to me that the moment that we are living is so crucial and important and absolutely changing of everything. And reading this passage, it just gives me this, I don't know how to put it, but it's almost like this hope. But it's a hope that will be, it will actually make this paragraph a reality. So we'll be dealing with a new challenge, but this probably human vanity or human creed or, that had brought us to inequality in so many levels is just one of these major tasks that we have to go through, because clearly there's a change coming, and it clearly, in my mind, it will be for the better eventually. It's a long process, and so I like this paragraph. I don't think that is the end of human existence. I think it's the end of just one of human dilemmas or problems. Of course, it's not like it'll be paradise. I think it's just gonna be a different path, so to speak.
Yes. So this part is not about the end of humanity or anything. It's and even when I mentioned about Emmanuel, is for Emmanuel perhaps was the end of the world that he was used to. He did not reincarnated in Rome once only. So I think when he speaks of this part, there is a little bit of nostalgia of the times where Rome was actually doing something that was good, even though, if you think about it, they were conquerors and this and that, but that was the way of the times. Today would be different. It would be a different way of conquering other civilizations or other peoples or other regions and areas. And it's true, yes, every time in history, there is something that is more pronounced. And unfortunately, we like dates, all of us. We love dates. But the truth is, if we think about the modifications that we are undergoing at the moment, they started when we started the first stage of the Industrial Revolution. So it's now, 250 years and counting. So this is not something that is just started yesterday or started with a pandemic or started with the internet or started with the sequencing of the human DNA. It's been coming, it's been coming very slowly, and it's picking up pace because everything now with technology moves faster. It's just that. It's just because technology has allowed us to do a lot more in less time. But if we look very carefully to our history and we have a very dispassionate point of view, we don't think of nationalisms, we don't think of political allegiances and this and that, we are going to see that the Industrial Revolution was an amazing turning point for humanity, because that is the very beginning where the production of the mass production of goods allowed of a more, be careful with this, a more democratic spreading of our resources. We are we're far from being completely democratic. I agree with that. But if we look at history until the Industrial Revolution, you could really count in perhaps one or two hands people that had access to whatever was available in those days. And with the mass production of goods, we started spreading. We even started spreading education. The very concept of schools did not exist until the Industrial Revolution. And it wouldn't exist for another 100 years still. So this process has been coming. And here in Rome, what we see is the end of an era of this conquering that is based on military forces marching over a land. This is perhaps one of the last moments in our history when we see successfully a massive enterprise, an entire political organization that annexes one area after another based on a marching military force. Then we are going to see later on that we are going to start the medieval times, the Dark Ages, and 1,000 years of absolute retreat into a more bucolic behavior, a more rural-based behavior. So we see stages in our history. In each one, like you pointed out quite nicely, this is the end of a particular trait, but not of an era or not of a civilization. No, just of a trait. Much like today, we are seeing the end of a few traits that our society, far still from being perfect, is still no longer entertaining anymore, will not accept as regular behavior, as common behavior anymore. Which shows that we are progressing, slowly, but we are progressing. Yes.
Julio.
Yes, Ron.
So someone asked me a question here on the chat, privately chat, so I'll just ask the question. I think you covered a little bit of it, but maybe you can expand.
Oh, sorry.
When we think about the Roman history, it's easy to find a parallel with our times. Can we find examples of progress, or are we still kind of at the same place?
No. To say that we are at the same place we would have to accept that over 2,000 years have passed and we have learned nothing. And if we look at ourselves today, we can definitely, with all the injustices in our world today, we cannot equate ourselves to Roman society. Let me tell you give you a particular example. Imagine that you are a lord, you are not a lord, but you are a person from the upper classes in Rome, and you have slaves, like everybody. And now there is a particular slave that is not, that is very sullen, very stubborn, does not do his job, for instance. And you want to dismiss the slave. Basically, you want to throw him in the streets. Now, Roman law said that in order for you to be eligible, legally speaking, to be eligible to dismiss a servant, you first had to torture him or her. We just look around today and we are going to see that that is not acceptable. I'm not saying that it might not happen, but there is no law that we are going to find that will actually say, oh yes, you have an employee and you want to dismiss this employee, you want to sack this, so you have to torture this person first. So this is just one very silly example, but it's because it's so brutal. Think about it. This was in the Roman code of law. You had to do this, right? And the other thing is the very fact that we had slaves, the very fact that you could actually own people, another point, right? So we have changed a lot. Of course, most of these Romans are still reincarnated today, as are the Greeks, as are the Persians, and so on and so forth. Okay, they have been moving, and as they have been moving throughout history, they've been moving towards the Western, primarily to the Western hemisphere, to the Western lands. But there is still, unfortunately, today, a lot of pride. People speak of the Roman Empire instead of admiring it when it was a republic, when it actually did all the good things that they did, which happened during the Republican period, not the Empire period. We think of the empire because we think of the games, we think of everything that instilled the senses, that excites the senses. And this is very unfortunate. And we still have some things when we think of emblems today, when we think of certain types of flags, certain types of mottos that people use. It's still something that we are borrowing from those days. But there are also good things. For those of us who live in New York City, we know that roughly every 7 streets, instead of having a a street that goes in one direction, it goes in two directions, right? And the street is wider. They borrowed that from the Roman Republic. As the Romans begin building newer cities or rebuilding their own cities, they always had every fifth street much wider so that the horses could move through back and forth when there was a fire, for instance, which was very common in those days since most habitations were actually made of wood. The entire sewage system of today is based on the Roman sewage system, which is still working under the modern city of Rome to this day. So we have borrowed good things as well. We are progressing. We should never allow ourselves to be disheartened by some horrible things we hear, or whether it's by reading the newspapers or online or by watching TV, the news on TV. We should never allow ourselves to think like that. We have to remember that humanity, we have to look at humanity as a whole, as if we were outside of our planet, looking at the planet as a little marble in our hands. Overall, we are moving forward, perhaps not at the speed that we would like. And this is particularly difficult if we are finding ourselves under some form of injustice, some form of oppression. But we cannot expand to the entire humanity our own anguishes. Overall, we are moving forward.
Just a quick comment on the title, The End of Human Vanity. I think I went to the Portuguese version, and I think it applies to a time, and what Emmanuel is trying to say here is that an empire that could have found a soul state on the planet was destroyed by its own vanity. So the end of human vanity applies to the end of the Roman Empire by itself, not as humanity in general. That's my understanding.
Yeah, it's the end of that Roman trait, Roman way of life.
And a missed opportunity.
Yeah. Good. We can start the next chapter, 14, because it's part of it, because it will be looking at the first Christians.
Okay.
Go ahead, Zoraida.
Okay.
Please.
The rise of Christianity, the early Christians. Having reached a period of new understanding about life's most serious problems, society at the time closely felt philosophical school's inability to solve its major issues. The notion of a more perfect justice for the oppressed classes had become a consuming matter for the nameless and suffering masses. Due to their sublime postulates of fraternity, teachings of Christ were a shelter for all the desperate and downcast. The afflicted multitudes seemed to be listening to that compassionate exhortation. Come unto me, you who suffer and hunger for justice, and I will comfort you. And from the cross, the comforting message of an unknown hope continued to reach out to them. The remembrance of a master's examples was not restricted only to the people of Judea, who had heard his eternal teachings firsthand. Many centurions and Roman citizens had personally known culminating events of the Savior's preaching. Throughout the Asia Minor, Greece, Africa, and even Gaul, as well as in Rome, people were talking about him and his new philosophy, which embraced all unfortunates and which was filled with the sacrosanct light of the kingdom of God and his righteousness. His doctrine of forgiveness and love brought a new light to souls, and his followers stood out in the corrupt environment of the time due to the purity of their habits and their upright and exemplary conduct. At first, the authorities of the empire did not concern themselves with the Nicene doctrine, but the apostles were teaching that in Jesus Christ, there was no difference between slaves and free, between patricians, and plebeians, because all were brothers and sisters, children of the same God. Patrician class saw nothing good about such a doctrine. Christians were accused of being sorcerers and heretics, and the time of martyrdom began with the first edicts of proscription. The state did not allow any independent associations other than those regarded as funeral cooperatives. So the followers of crucified one took advantage of this exception and began the famous activities in the catacombs.
Thank you. Well, if we look at a society that is based on slavery, based on human trafficking, and based on the use and disposal of human beings as mere property, to the point that their value was based on how much they could work. That was about it. As they got older, they would be just, as I said, disposed of, right? If you think of a society that is based like that, a society that is based on, legally speaking, on torturing your own, let's say, employees, right? Your slaves, in order to, even to dismiss them, you can imagine that if now you have someone saying that we have to pay good, you have to retribute good for evil, if you have a doctrine that says that we are all brothers and sisters under the same God, under the same Father, this flies right in the face of what society is used to do, even of what's around the very basis or the very foundation of that society. Because if now I have to see in my slave a brother or a sister of mine, eventually that slave is going to question whether he or she does not deserve a better life. You know, does not, if let's say doesn't, I deserve to be paid for my work, or I deserve to have quarters, proper quarters for, so that I can have a place to sleep, I can have a place where I can have a hot meal, and so on and so forth. So you have this individual that now comes and throws with his gentleness, with his candidness, throws in the face of all the governors of the time concepts that are completely against what they had been applying, or what they have been using in their societies. So it is expected that this can create attrition, that this can create actually a clash. And it did. We have the clash starts right away by the crucifixion of our own master. And then we see that eventually it started very slowly, but as the poor classes were numerous, there was no middle class. We do not have a concept of middle class. We have plebeians, we have patricians, and we have slaves. But the slaves outnumber the patricians and the plebeians by the hundreds, if not by the thousands, especially in Rome. So you have now this vast ocean, this horde of people right next to you, hearing that they have rights as much as you give yourself. And of course, if you are in a position of power, if you are in a position of privilege, even if you don't have necessarily power, but you have some privileges, you will see those privileges being jeopardized, because it's like you are in the beach and there's this tsunami coming towards you. The tsunami would be the representation of this massive number of slaves, of individuals who are completely destitute of everything. They have nothing. They are not even citizens. So what are you going to do? You're going to try to squelch this particular type of philosophical belief. This philosophical belief does not match those that either put you in power, keep you in power, or give you the privileges that you are used to. And of course, that is actually it's a situation that ironically only ends up contributing even more to the propagation of the Christian doctrine, of the Christian philosophical belief. Because first of all, the number of people that are, thirsty for justice, as hunger for justice actually, are that number is much larger than the number of those with privileges in that society. So, and the more you oppress them, the more you convert them into martyrs. And having martyrs is actually the best way to foment the exact philosophy that those individuals were preaching to begin with. So we have this spreading quickly after a certain point, and then the authorities begin to retaliate, trying to squelch the doctrine. Notice that we speak of the Christian doctrine. It's not a religion. That's point number one that is, I think it's important for us to note. The second point is where the whole idea of the catacombs started. So it got to a point where Rome would only allow its citizens to have anything related to Christianity, to the Christian doctrine, if it was at the time of death. So with the excuse for that, they started meeting in the catacombs. Eventually, the catacombs also became a place of refuge. When the authorities realized that they were losing terrain, that they were losing control of the situation, and they began actively persecuting. Now was no longer a question of just writing edicts and pronouncing them. This was now to the Praetorial Guard. The Praetorial Guard is now not only there to protect the emperor, but it's also to massacre the first Christians. So then the catacombs that were now just a place where they could cultivate their ideas, their doctrine, now also become a place of refuge, a hiding place, basically. And one might say, why the catacombs? Because there's a lot of superstition. We have to remember that the Romans were polytheists and continue to be polytheists during this entire period. The Romans die polytheists. When Rome, especially the emperor, the Western Empire, because by the time we get to the first Christians, Rome ends up being divided into two parts: the Empire of the West and the Empire of the East. The Empire of the East had its capital in Constantinople, and the Empire of the West in Rome, continues to be in Rome. So, but the Romans, the hardcore Romans, they died polytheists. Okay, so we have here a situation where at first they are meeting at the catacombs just because it is the protected and allowed, permissible place. And eventually the catacombs become their hiding place. And hiding place because being polytheists, the Romans, especially the soldiers, were superstitious. And there were certain things about not disturbing the dead. So this was a perfect place for the Christians. First, because they did not put so much effort in the physical body as the Master had instructed us. They believed that the physical body was something passing, temporary, not for the Romans. So the catacombs became a perfect hiding place, because it was the very superstition of the polytheist Romans that prevented them from persecuting the Christians even further down into the catacombs. Any questions? No? Okay, Zoraida, go ahead.
The spread of Christianity. The number of proselytes of the new faith began to grow in Judea. Major and the Calvary's hymn of hope spread a sweet and eternal fragrance among souls. Thus it was that the apostles whose endeavor Christ had blessed with his mercy, spread the light of the good news far and wide, sharing the miraculous bread of faith with all the starving of heart. The doctrine of the crucified one spread like wildfire. It was proclaimed not only in Rome, but in the Gaul and North Africa. Advocates and detractors appeared. The most eminent proselytes sought to spread the teachings, disseminating ideas and interpretations. The first churches appeared under the direction of an apostle or a more distinguished and studious disciple. The centralization and unity of the Roman Empire facilitated the moving about of the new missionaries. One could take the word of faith to the most obscure corners of the globe without the exigencies and obstacles of borders. Because of the favor of the masses, no doctrine had ever attained such standing in the world. This is because the divine master had sealed the words of his eternal lessons with his example. The greatest revolutionary of all time, he had banished no other weapons but love and tolerance, education and enlightenment, condemned all hypocrites, and rebelled against all the officialized violence, simultaneously teaching his disciples unconditional love towards order, work, and constructive peace. This is why the gospel comprise the ultimate book for humankind. The simplicity and uniqueness are clear in the translations of every language on earth, holding people's souls amid the light of heaven at the soft allure of its narratives.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we have covered quite a lot of this text. The idea here is that the very structure of the Roman Empire, the roads that they built so efficiently and pretty much everywhere, to the point that we have the old saying, all roads lead to Rome, right? This was not something that was just said willy-nilly, you know, without, it meant that all roads were so, the road system was so interconnected that it didn't matter which road you were in, you would end up in Rome, as long as you had enough energy to walk or to, you know, to go on a horse ride, you would be there, you would get there. So the idea is that this very infrastructure assisted the first individuals, the first proselytes, the first Christians. Proselytes are those who are speaking in public, are those who are bringing an idea to a public. So those who are speaking in any form of gathering, of large gathering. And we have these individuals, and of course they are assisted. They are the ones who eventually begin to found the first churches. Now, let us be careful here with the word. The word has not been mistranslated. It is the word that is in the original. But we need to understand what church means here. This is not Catholic church or Baptist church or Protestant. This is like a place of worship. A place of worship that is not in a home necessarily, but that is now taking a construction, a building of its own, or a location. You know, the first catacombs, the first places in the catacombs were actually small churches in this sense of the word, in this very strict sense of the words, of the word. So we have to be very careful not to equate, because today if we say church, we necessarily mean Catholic, Baptist, or Protestant church, the place of, but here we just want to convey a place for worship. Okay? So these are the first individuals, these are the first advocates, but in the same way that you have the advocates, you're going to raise the detractors. The master was not concerned with it. Only the truth survives everything. And there have been detractors from day one. And look, more than 2,000 years later, and we're still discussing, we're still debating, and we still have detractors saying the most horrible things. But the most important thing is that it has survived. And if it has survived, is that its truth is now time-honored. It is time-honored because the master did not just preach, he lived by example, which is what it says at the very end here. of this part that we read. Any questions?
Okay.
No?
Okay.
So right, just before you read this part, I
Mhm.
want to make a comment. I would like everyone to correct the word redaction and
Mhm.
write composition, because in English, the word redaction does not necessarily mean the same as in Portuguese. So it's a false cognate. The words look very similar, in between the two languages, but in English, the word redaction is used. For instance, if I am an editor and one of you decides to write a manuscript, an article, a piece of news or something, or a book, when I edit that before publication, I am redacting your text. Redacting is compiling a text and checking it prior to publication. The idea here is putting together the definitive texts, the Gospels. So it's composition, which is also false cognate, because in Portuguese, if we say composition, it looks like it's like a child's first attempt at writing a little text, but not in English. Okay, so composition of the definitive texts.
Okay. Composition of the definitive text. At that time, when the formidable war of criticism sought to undermine the immortal edifice of the new doctrine, Christ's messengers presided over the redaction or the composition of the definitive text with an eye on the future, not only for the apostles and their disciples, but also the centers of society. The most distinguished Christians exchanged letters of great doctrinal value with one another on behalf of the various churches. There were messages of fraternity and love that posterity often could not or did not want to understand. Several literary schools of historical criticism have formed lately to study and elucidate these doctrines. The term apocryphal has become the scarecrow of the whole world. Many histories have been written, countless theories have been enunciated. However, in their study of religious ideas, the learned materialists have not grasped the fact that intuition is greater than reason, and most of them have erred in their exposition of the principles and presentations of the great figures of Christianity. The grandeur of the doctrine does not lie in the circumstance of the Gospels actually being those of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. It lies in the immortal beauty that radiates from the divine lessons, which have attracted souls down through the ages. There is no advantage in long, drawn-out arguments about the authenticity of a letter by Ignatius or Achito or Paul of Tarsus, because absolute rationalism does not possess elements for the conclusive proof required. General opinion will resolve around the most eminent theorist, according to the conventions of the time. Nonetheless, literary authority cannot present a mathematical equation on the matter. Within the heart, only the essence must prevail, and as far as the sublime acquisitions of faith are concerned, intuition must lead reason, introducing generous and definitive understanding.
Thank you.
Well,
So Zoraida, by having said all of that, and the rest of us who have listened to it, we have now, by either saying it, in the case of Zoraida, or hearing it for the rest of us, we have signed with the blood of our essence, of our spirit, so to speak, now and in perpetuity, that we are forfeiting our right to ask from now on whose the message is.
Right.
Okay, this is exactly what we still doing this. We debate, oh, is it signed by this spirit, by this high? Don't go there. Look at the content. I know Emmanuel is sounding very maudlin here, perhaps because he sees how much we debate uselessly. How much we debate about the rhetoric, about the grammar, about this, that, and the other, when we should actually be looking at the content of the text. Does it matter if it's from Luke, Paul, Matthew, this, that, or the other, or even from a person whose name is not part of history? It does not, if the content is a content of love, of beauty, of understanding, of fraternity, solidarity. This is the essence of what Emmanuel is telling us here. Because he is warning us that we get very, very attached to dotting every I, crossing every T, but we forgot to look at the words that are being formed by the I's and the T's. We should look at those words first. It is important, of course it is important to be careful with the spelling, be careful with the grammar. Of course it's important to have historians trying to trace these documents back. All of this is not saying that it's not bad, but a lot of us end up just doing that, the mechanical, materialistic part, and we forget about the message. So we can go at each other's throats about who wrote what in terms of a particular psychography, but we don't read what the psychography is actually telling us. And worse, we don't even apply, because we never read it to begin with or paid attention to it. We never apply. And this happened to the master. My God, if it happened to the master, imagine what we are doing today with psychographies of much lesser spirits in terms of moral development and intellectual development. It's no surprise that we are still doing it. But we should look at this and see, look, a man is telling us that it happened to the first Gospels, that it happens to the letters that Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, to the Corinthians, and so many other letters. We should not worry so much. Was it Paul who wrote it? When did he write? No. Just look at the content. See if the content is a content that we can apply to our lives. See if we can learn. See if it's something that is constructive, edifying. If it is, then we can worry about who wrote when and how and why. But first, the content. First and foremost. And it's a form of materialism, by the way, that we disguise with a veil of religiosity that is as thin as our real intentions, in terms of improving ourselves. When we behave in this manner, we have only this little, this coating, like a varnish, this very thin coating that everything can go through. A very thin coating of religiosity, of improving oneself, when as a matter of fact, we're just disguising again pride, vanity, arrogance, a materialistic form of living. Here, materialistic not in the sense of consumerism, materialistic in the sense of being bound to the material, to the physical plane, to this plane of existence, instead of looking at the content, learning from it, and improving ourselves by applying the teachings from that content in our daily lives. Okay. Go ahead, Sarai.
Okay. Paul's mission. In the endeavor of redacting the Gospels, which without a doubt comprise a marvelous foundation of Christianity, a number of problems appear at the time regarding giving them a valuable universal character. All the master's apostles had come from the humble theater of his glorious teachings, but even though those very glorious fishermen While high order spirits on a mission, we have to remember that they were still far from the master's spiritual level and thus experienced the influences of their environment. As soon as the Lamb went back to the realms of light, the Christian community in general began to suffer the influence of Judaism. Nearly all the organized centers of the doctrine strove to preserve an aristocratic character in light of the new churches and associations being founded in the most diverse locations of the world. Thus, Jesus decided to call upon the luminous and energetic spirit of Paul of Tarsus to help carry out his ministry. This decision was one of the most significant events in the history of Christianity. The deeds and letters of Paul became a powerful universalizing element for the new doctrine. From city to city, from church to church, the Damascus convert used his enormous prestige to inflame hearts as he spoke of the Master. At first, there was a painful situation of misunderstanding between him and the other apostles, but his providential influence was meant to prevent an unjustifiable aristocracy within the Christian community during his unforgettable time of simplicity and purity.
Thank you. So, one of the problems that we have, all of us, when we try to explain the words of our master is that we are not as intellectually and morally evolved as he is. So it's like a bad telephone conversation. He's talking to us, we're listening, but there's a lot of static in the line. It doesn't matter if you have the latest cell phone, 5G or whatever, even if that G is for God. What matters is we don't understand it properly. Even when the words come clearly to us, as we put them together, our spirits are not advanced enough to grasp all the subtleties, all the beautiful nuances of the teachings. It's part of our progress. And the more we evolve, the more we learn from the same teaching, from the same word, from the same conversation, the same telephone call. The telephone call doesn't change, we do. We become more perceptive and also more receptive of the same words. So the same happened to the very first Christians. They were imbued with the highest, the loftiest goals, the great efforts that today we would never do. It's so far-fetched for us. You know, the fact that they actually walked from city to city, we would never do that today. We would think that they were crazy. So, but they did. They walked from place to place, sometimes not even having a place to stay. They had to rely on the generosity and on the customs of the time that actually said that you could put up, you know, someone, a traveler, in your home. So anyway, what we have here is that the result of this is that all that the master left us was already somewhat conspurcated, somewhat deviated by those, not intentionally, not maliciously, by those who were preaching it. But then another situation happened that contributed a lot more, and this is actually more serious. Suffering the influence of Judaism, we have in Judaism the figure of the rabbi, who is not only, especially at the time, we have to think about what it was then, okay? They were the doctors of the law. This is not just someone who is going to the synagogue to debate the scriptures. This is a person who represents the law. It's the representation of the law debated and discussed as much as possible, but still the representative of that law, and an indirect representative of the divine presence. Not that they were divine in origin, not that. Do not get things confused. But the law being divine in essence, in nature, and their being there, its representative here in the physical plane, they were indirectly representatives of the on high. So you can have an individual under these situations who is very modest, who is very enlightened, an absolute wise individual. I would say wise men because at the time there were only men that were allowed to occupy positions like that, whether in Judaism or in any other situation or religion or sect or faith. What happens is that the same way that you can have one individual who is very wise, who is modest, who understands that that is a responsibility rather than a privilege, you are going to have those on the opposite side of the spectrum who use that to gain privileges and benefits and so on and so forth. And that was, since humanity was not as evolved as it should be, that was actually more of the general idea rather than the exception. So you would have those individuals having their own interpretations of the scriptures, having them forced upon the community that were right under in their umbrellas. And this was actually borrowed by the first Christians, who began to separate, sectorizing themselves by having separate interpretations, personal interpretations of the teachings of our Master. At first, perhaps, I would say that from the anthropological point of view, I believe that at first it happened without malice or intent. But eventually, it began, some of them must have realized that this was a form of control, of power, and began to exercise that sectarianism on purpose with an intent, with the intent of holding the masses under their own, with their own leashes. So what we see is now a Christianity that is going towards a very dangerous terrain, the terrain of vanity. So you see, it wasn't the end of vanity. It was the end of vanity of the Roman Empire. Now we see another type of vanity. We're always finding ways of, because of our ignorance, particularly, we always find ways of disturbing or conspurcating something. So now even the first Christians begin to move out of their main goal. And this is when Paul of Tarsus comes to help by preaching, by going from place to place. And think about it, this is right after our Master has passed away. We are not talking about 1,000 years later. So now Paul of Tarsus is re-educating these individuals who were there with the Master himself and redirecting them, pulling them away from that road of perdition, that road of vanity, of self-centeredness, back to the road of wisdom, to the road of education of themselves first and foremost, and then of those under their protection or under their jurisdiction, because now we are beginning to form these houses of worship. So you can even say, this is my jurisdiction, or this is my flock, or this is my assembly. So we needed already then someone to re-educate those, even those who had the best of intentions. We have to be very careful. And this is something we have to ask ourselves today. With all that we have, with all the lectures that are around, with all the books that are around, everything that we have, all the many different forms of media, Are we studying them correctly? Are we not trying to subvert them in some way or another, even if not with the intention of gaining anything in particular, but simply by forcing the text to our behavior rather than our behavior being modified by the texts? Because we all do this in one way or another. The more careful we are, the less we do. That's true. But if we are not careful, and this is why the Master said, pray and be vigilant. If we are not vigilant of our own behavior, not of the behavior of others, that is very easy and we all do that. No, of our own behavior. If you're not careful to modulate, to invigilate, police our own behavior, we are bound to repeat the mistakes that perhaps one of us, being one of those first Christians, did, of moving away from the doctrine of the Master. Then perhaps lack of experience. 2,000 years later, well, hard to justify lack of experience after 2,000 years. But we all do. So again, Emmanuel is calling to our attention in a way between the lines, calling to our attention this particular aspect of our personalities, that we should be very careful that we are not like these first Christians that began acknowledging and accepting influences from other things, and by that toppling over the building, the edifice of Christianity, by adding rituals, by adding, which we're going to see as we go into the next chapter, 15 actually, we'll talk about then the first churches, the real churches, Catholicism. We see that was what happened. A doctrine of good for evil, of exchanging good for evil, a doctrine of forgiveness became a religion, an institutionalized corporation that eventually reached its apex of being almost 180 degrees from the teachings of our Master. So we have to be very careful. It happened already with the first Christians, and it's still happening today. And even Spiritism is not immune to it. If we are not careful and we begin adding personalisms, our own ideas to this, that, and the other concept, we don't listen to others. I begin saying, for instance, oh, only I know everything, nobody else knows anything. Whenever we do things like that, we have to be very careful. Of course, we Spiritists have a very good way of getting out of this dilemma, right? We say, oh, I'm being obsessed. The coward's way out. Always blame the other side. It's invisible, right? I'm not even looking at them in the face. This is the moral cowardice, the worst form of cowardice. The worst form of moral cowardice. We have to be very careful with that, especially for us Spiritists, so that we do not repeat a 2,000-year-old mistake. Perhaps we won't have another Paul of Tarsus to help us. We have the books, we have the lectures, we have Spiritist centers to talk to, we have friends who read a lot that can give us some inkling, some ideas, but we have to go after the information. We have to open ourselves to the teachings. Remember that no one can teach what they do not know, and no one can teach anyone who does not want to learn. So if we do not want to learn, we won't learn, no matter how many resources are around us. And if we don't learn, how are we going to teach if we don't know it to begin with? So any questions? I will stop here.
Yeah, I think this this one page comes before one of the greatest books on spiritism, Paul and Stephen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yes. Emmanuel brings a couple of years later 600-page book expanding on this one page.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really, you fully understand all the conflicts and all the difficulties that Paul of Tarsus first saw and then Paul had to bring Christianity out of this influence of Judaism of the time that was mainly under the direction of James in the house of the way, as James and Peter had this house, and the importance of the vision of Paul as of the teachings of Christ and where and how it should be spread, but also, of course, understanding the importance of James trying to prevent Judaism to destroy the beginnings of Christianity, because it was through James that they were able to continue existing at that time. And between both of them, opposite sides of the Christianity, the nascent Christianity, the great figure of Peter being in the middle of it and coordinating the efforts on both sides and trying to be trying to prevent crisis and trying to build on both wonderful works that were being doing, especially by Paul of Tarsus, but also protecting a little bit James from the attacks on the other side. So it's a book that you have to read, reread, and read, because every time you read, you find beautiful new information on Christianity.
Yes, I recommend it too. It's beautiful. Even if someone doesn't like very much the reading about the times or the apostles or this, it's still just from the point of this, as Ron was saying, the idea of how the whole thing started and how it had to be managed, but managed in a way that was still fraternal, because it wasn't managed by the sword. It wasn't managed by a political position. It was managed by example of living, of behavior. It's quite beautiful.
May I
Yes.
ask a question? How far and wide had the apostles gone in their dispersing of the word, so to speak? How could they coordinate that? I mean, had they gone further than a day's walk, or I can't really have a concept. I don't have an understanding of this, how they could reconnect, because they were already branched out, all the apostles. Is that correct?
Right.
Thank you.
I really do not know the answer, let's say, for each apostle, but I know that their influence, whether directly or indirectly by like another emissary, reached pretty much everywhere in the empire. So we are talking about the entire Judea, of course, area of Judea, the entire Palestine. So we are having also Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, Italy, then the south of France, Gaul, and we have the whole north part of the African continent. Pretty much wherever there was a Roman road, they had been. By the time we are discussing all this, they had already reached the let's say, not necessarily the confines of the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire went all the way to India, in its most eastern extreme and all the way to Britain. So they didn't get there by this time. Okay, that happens during the Middle Ages, what is now beginning. So we're talking about after the fourth century. So it's beginning of the 4th century onwards. But by this time, pretty much that Mediterranean area, because also of the shipping routes, they had been pretty much everywhere.
Thank you, Julio. Appreciate it.
Okay. So before we go to the final prayer, just a reminder, next Sunday, which is the last Sunday of the month, and normally we have a lecture, we're going to study the gospel because we have not studied the gospel this month. Last week we had a lecture, so it's just we're doing the gospel next Sunday. Okay. And the fundamentals of mediumship will continue that, in the last Sunday of August, or August has 5 Sundays, so we'll have to find we will do the lecture, and we'll do one Q&A session. Okay. All right. Who's going to do our final prayer? Carol?
Yes, thank you. Infinite Creator and Supreme Intelligence, we are grateful for the opportunity today to be together, to again reunite and to study the information on the way to the light. We are grateful for a deeper understanding of the early days of Christianity and the issues that pride and vanity have created, not only at that time, but continues to even invest and involve us these days. We give thanks to our spiritual benefactors, the good spirits, the mentors, the healers, the teachers, and the directors, who are also assisting us each day to improve our lives and to bring forth these heartfelt teachings, that we may create a better world for our family, our friends, our loved ones, ourselves, and the world. May we continue to go forth throughout the week to continue and expand our prayers, our mindfulness, our studies, and to take stock of the issues at hand, to take stock of our personal traits and our ability to actually improve our lives and to redo the things that have gone awry. We are grateful for the light and love of Christ to be within us, and that we may share this with others as we go forth throughout the week. We humbly close this meeting with a prayer of thanksgiving and gratefulness. We appreciate all the opportunities that we have together as brothers and sisters on the path. May we join our prayers in unity as we go forth. May we leave now with a goodness and peace within our hearts. Go forth as beacons of light. Go forth now in peace. So be it.
So be it.